On a crisp October morning in 1992, 8-year-old Sarah Chen walked out of her family's modest two-story home on Maple Street, clutching her worn canvas backpack filled with coloring books and Sunday school worksheets, never to return. What happened next would haunt the small town of Millbrook for decades, tearing apart a close-knit religious community and exposing dark secrets that had been festering in the shadows of stained glass windows and prayer circles. Sarah's disappearance would become the kind of case that defines a place forever, the kind that makes parents grip their children's hands a little tighter, that transforms a peaceful Sunday morning ritual into something tinged with fear and suspicion. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how long the truth remained hidden in plain sight, protected by the very institution that was supposed to keep Sarah safe. Millbrook, Massachusetts was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where front doors remained unlocked and children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. With a population of just over 4,000, it was a town that prided itself on its values, its sense of community, and most importantly, its faith. The heart of Millbrook wasn't its small downtown area or even its elementary school. It was St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, a beautiful stone building that had stood on the town green since 1847. The Chen family had moved to Millbrook in 1987 when Sarah was just 3 years old. David Chen, a soft-spoken accountant with wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle demeanor, had taken a position at the local bank. His wife Margaret was a kindergarten teacher at Millbrook Elementary, beloved by her students and respected throughout the community. They had chosen this town specifically because of its reputation as a safe place to raise children, a place where traditional values still mattered. Sarah was their only child, and she was everything they had hoped for. Small for her age, with straight black hair that her mother would carefully braid each morning, and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around her, Sarah was known for her quiet intelligence and her genuine kindness. She was the type of child who would spend her recess helping younger students tie their shoes, who would save her allowance to buy food for the church food drive, who would sit patiently while her mother corrected papers at the kitchen table, coloring quietly in her workbooks. The family attended St. Matthew's religiously, quite literally. Every Sunday morning they would walk the 6 blocks from their house to the church, Sarah skipping ahead in her best dress, her backpack bouncing against her small frame. She loved Sunday school, loved the stories about Jesus and the disciples, loved the craft projects and the songs. Her teacher, Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, would later tell police that Sarah was one of her most engaged students, always raising her hand to answer questions, always eager to help distribute crayons and construction paper. St. Matthew's was more than just a place of worship for the Chen family. It was their community. Margaret sang in the choir, David served as a deacon, and Sarah participated in every children's program the church offered. The congregation had welcomed them with open arms, and they had found in Millbrook the kind of belonging they had been searching for. Father Michael Brennan had been the rector of St. Matthew's for 8 years by the time Sarah disappeared. He was a man in his early 40s, tall and lean with prematurely gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had come to Millbrook from a larger parish in Boston, seeking what he called a simpler way to serve God. The congregation adored him. He was charismatic in the pulpit, compassionate in counseling, and seemed to have a special gift for connecting with children. Parents would often comment on how Father Brennan would remember every child's name, would ask about their school projects, would make time to listen to their concerns, no matter how trivial they might seem. Sarah was no exception. She would light up when Father Brennan would stop by the Sunday school classroom, would beam with pride when he would compliment her drawings of biblical scenes, would seek him out after service to tell him about her week. Margaret Chen would later remember how Sarah would practice her Bible verses extra carefully because she wanted to impress Father Brennan, how she would ask if they could arrive early to church so she could help him set up for Sunday school. In retrospect, the signs were all there. But in 1992, in a small New England town where faith was paramount and trust was given freely, No one thought to look for darkness in the house of God. October 18, 1992, dawned gray and cool, with the kind of overcast sky that hinted at rain but never quite delivered. It was the kind of morning that made Sarah's mother consider keeping her daughter home from church. But Margaret Chen was not the type to let weather interfere with their Sunday routine. Besides, Sarah had been looking forward to Sunday school all week. They were working on a craft project about Noah's Ark, and she had been excited to finish gluing the animals she had cut out from construction paper. The Chen family's Sunday morning routine was as predictable as clockwork. Margaret would wake at 6:30 a.m., start the coffee, and begin preparing breakfast while David showered. Sarah would wake naturally around 7:00 a.m., already chattering about the day ahead. They would eat breakfast together, usually scrambled eggs, toast, and orange juice, while Sarah told them about her Sunday school lesson and asked questions about the Bible story they would be learning. That particular morning, Sarah was wearing her favorite dress, a navy blue wool dress with small white flowers that her grandmother had sent for her birthday. She had insisted on wearing her white tights and black patent leather shoes, even though Margaret had warned her that the shoes might be uncomfortable for the walk to church. Sarah's hair was pulled back in its usual neat braid, secured with a small white ribbon that matched the flowers on her dress. At 8:45 a.m. the family left their house on Maple Street, walking their usual route to St. Matthew's. The church was only 6 blocks away, and they always took the same path, down Maple Street to Oak Avenue, then left onto Church Street, which led directly to the town green where St. Matthew's stood. It was a pleasant walk, lined with the kind of well-maintained colonial homes that gave Millbrook its postcard-perfect appearance. But this morning was different. As they reached the corner of Oak Avenue and Church Street, Sarah suddenly stopped walking. She had forgotten her backpack, the small canvas bag that contained her Sunday school materials, including the half-finished Noah's Ark project she was so excited to complete. Margaret Chen would later replay this moment in her mind thousands of times, wondering what would have happened if she had simply told Sarah that the project could wait until next week. Instead, she told Sarah to run back home and get her backpack while she and David continued to church. It was a decision that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. Sarah was a responsible child. The walk was short and safe, and they had made it many times before. Millbrook was the kind of place where parents didn't think twice about letting their children walk alone, especially on a Sunday morning when the streets were quiet and peaceful. "I'll meet you at Sunday school," Sarah called over her shoulder as she ran back toward Maple Street, her black patent leather shoes clicking against the sidewalk. Those were the last words Margaret Chen would ever hear her daughter speak. Sarah never made it to Sunday school that morning. When Margaret arrived at St. Matthew's and found that Sarah hadn't arrived yet, she wasn't immediately concerned. She assumed Sarah had simply taken her time getting her backpack, maybe had stopped to retie her shoes, or had gotten distracted by something along the way. Children were often late to Sunday school, and Sarah was generally responsible about getting where she needed to be. But as the minutes ticked by and the Sunday school lesson began without Sarah, Margaret began to feel a growing sense of unease. It wasn't like Sarah to be late for something she was excited about. It wasn't like her to forget to tell her parents if she was going to be delayed. By 9:30 a.m., when Sunday school was half over and there was still no sign of Sarah, Margaret excused herself and walked quickly back toward their house, expecting to find her daughter sitting on the front porch, having forgotten her key. The house was empty. Sarah's backpack was gone from where she had left it on the kitchen counter. But Sarah was nowhere to be found. Margaret ran back to the church, her heart pounding and her mind racing through possibilities. Maybe Sarah had taken a different route. Maybe she had stopped at a friend's house. Maybe she had gotten confused about the time. But when she burst into the Sunday school classroom, interrupting Mrs. Morrison's lesson about the flood, she found only worried faces and no sign of her daughter. David was summoned from the main service, and together they began searching the church grounds. They checked every room, every closet, every corner where an 8-year-old might hide or play. They asked everyone they encountered if they had seen Sarah, but no one had. Father Brennan joined the search, his face grave with concern, organizing other parishioners to help look for the missing child. By 10:30 a.m., it was clear that Sarah was not simply running late or hiding somewhere in the church. She was gone. And with that realization, the quiet Sunday morning in Millbrook transformed into something else entirely. The beginning of a nightmare that would consume the town for decades to come. The Millbrook Police Department was not equipped to handle a missing child case. In a town where the most serious crimes were typically vandalism and the occasional drunk driving incident, the disappearance of 8-year-old Sarah Chen was unprecedented. Police Chief Robert Harrison, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement but new to Millbrook, would later admit that his department was overwhelmed from the moment Margaret Chen called 911 at 10:47 a.m. The initial response was swift but scattered. Within an hour, every available officer was combing the streets of Millbrook, knocking on doors, checking backyards, and questioning anyone who might have seen Sarah that morning. The Massachusetts State Police were contacted, and by early afternoon, detectives from the county sheriff's office had arrived to assist with the investigation. The search for Sarah quickly became a community effort. Members of St. Matthew's congregation canceled their Sunday plans and joined the search. Neighbors emerged from their houses, offering help and sharing what little information they had. The local volunteer fire department organized search parties, dividing the town into grids and systematically checking every possible location where an 8-year-old might be found. As the hours passed and no trace of Sarah was discovered, the mood in Millbrook shifted from concern to fear. Parents who had allowed their children to walk freely around town just that morning were now keeping them close, their sense of security shattered by the reality that a child could simply vanish in broad daylight in their safe, small town. The investigation focused initially on the most logical explanations. Had Sarah simply gotten lost? Had she wandered off the familiar path and become confused? Had she been injured somehow and was unable to call for help? Search teams combed through the wooded areas on the outskirts of town, checked storm drains and construction sites, and questioned every resident along the route between the Chen House and St. Matthew's. But as the first day of searching yielded no results, investigators began to consider more sinister possibilities. The small backpack Sarah had returned home to retrieve became a crucial piece of evidence, or rather, the absence of it did. If Sarah had simply gotten lost or injured, wouldn't the backpack be found with her? The fact that both Sarah and her belongings had vanished suggested something more deliberate, more frightening. Detective Linda Martinez from the state police took the lead on the case, working closely with Chief Harrison and the local officers. Martinez was a seasoned investigator with experience in missing persons cases, but even she was struck by how few leads the investigation was generating. It was as if Sarah had simply evaporated into thin air somewhere between her family's house and the church. The interviews began that first evening. Every member of the Chen family was questioned extensively, though more to establish a timeline than out of suspicion. David and Margaret Chen were clearly devastated parents, not potential suspects. The family had no enemies, no history of problems, no reason anyone would want to harm their daughter. They were, by all accounts, exactly what they appeared to be. Loving parents whose world had been turned upside down in an instant. The questioning extended to the church community. Every member of St. Matthew's who had been present that morning was interviewed, asked about what they had seen, when they had arrived, whether they had noticed anything unusual. The Sunday school teachers were questioned extensively, as were the other children in Sarah's class. Father Brennan was interviewed twice, once briefly on Sunday evening, and again more thoroughly on Monday morning. Throughout these initial interviews, Father Brennan was nothing but helpful and cooperative. He provided detailed information about Sarah's involvement in church activities, spoke movingly about what a special child she was, and offered to do anything he could to assist with the search. He organized prayer vigils, provided comfort to the Chen family, and opened the church as a headquarters for volunteer searchers. If anyone suspected that the beloved rector might be involved in Sarah's disappearance, they kept those suspicions to themselves. The search continued through the week, expanding beyond Millbrook to neighboring towns and counties. Posters with Sarah's picture, a school photo showing her sweet smile and bright eyes, appeared on telephone poles, in store windows, and on car bumpers throughout central Massachusetts. The case received coverage in the regional newspapers and on local television news, generating tips and sightings that investigators dutifully followed up on, though none led to any solid leads. The Chen family's life became a blur of police interviews, search efforts, and media attention. Margaret took leave from her teaching position, unable to focus on anything other than finding her daughter. David struggled to maintain his composure during the day while breaking down in private. Both parents aged years in the span of a single week, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and grief. The church community rallied around the family, bringing meals, offering support, and maintaining a constant presence at the Chen house. But even as the congregation came together in their shared concern for Sarah, cracks were beginning to show. Some members whispered about whether the family should have been more careful, whether letting Sarah walk alone had been irresponsible. Others wondered if there were dangers in Millbrook that they had been blind to, if their peaceful town was not as safe as they had believed. A week after Sarah's disappearance, with no new leads and no sign of the missing girl, the investigation seemed to be stalling. The massive search efforts had yielded nothing. The interviews had provided no suspects. The case was becoming one of those tragic mysteries that haunted small towns for generations. A child who had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and grief. But on October 26th, 8 days after Sarah Chen had disappeared, a breakthrough finally came, and it would change everything. The security camera at Miller's hardware store on Oak Avenue was an old system, installed more as a deterrent than as a serious security measure. The image quality was poor, the angle was limited, and the owner, Harold Miller, rarely bothered to check the recordings unless there was a specific reason. But when Detective Martinez asked him to review the footage from the morning of October 18th, Miller dutifully pulled out the grainy black and white tapes and began scanning through them. What he found sent shockwaves through the investigation. At 9:03 a.m. on the morning Sarah disappeared, the camera had captured her walking along Oak Avenue, her small figure clearly visible as she hurried back toward her house to retrieve her forgotten backpack. She was alone, moving quickly, her braid bouncing as she walked. The footage showed her disappearing from the camera's range as she continued toward Maple Street. But more importantly, at 9:08 a.m., the camera captured Sarah walking back toward the church, her backpack now clearly visible on her shoulders. This was the last confirmed sighting of Sarah Chen alive, and it established a crucial timeline for investigators. She had successfully retrieved her backpack and was on her way to Sunday school when something had happened to her. The footage also revealed something else, something that would prove to be the most significant piece of evidence in the case. At 9:09 a.m., just 1 minute after Sarah had passed by the camera heading toward church, a dark-colored sedan drove slowly along Oak Avenue in the same direction. The car was moving unusually slowly, as if the driver was looking for something or someone. The license plate was not visible, and the image quality was too poor to make out specific details about the vehicle or its occupant. But the timing was unmistakable. Sarah had walked past the camera at 9:08 a.m. The car had followed the same route just 1 minute later, and Sarah had never arrived at Sunday school. The discovery of the footage energized the investigation. Finally, there was concrete evidence that something had happened to Sarah, that her disappearance was not simply a case of a lost child, but likely an abduction. The dark sedan became the focus of intense scrutiny, with investigators canvassing the area to find anyone who might have seen the vehicle that morning. The response was frustrating in its lack of specificity. Several residents remembered seeing a dark car in the area that morning, but the descriptions were vague and sometimes contradictory. Some said it was black, others dark blue or dark green. Some thought it was a large sedan. Others believed it might have been a smaller car. No one had paid close enough attention to note the license plate number or any other identifying details. But the footage had accomplished something crucial. It had transformed the investigation from a missing person case to a potential abduction case. The Massachusetts State Police dedicated additional resources to the investigation, and the FBI was contacted to provide assistance. The case began to receive broader media attention, with Sarah's story appearing on regional television news programs and in newspapers across New England. The discovery of the footage also had a profound impact on the Millbrook community. The realization that someone had deliberately taken Sarah, that a predator had been driving through their quiet streets looking for a victim, shattered the town's sense of security completely. Parents who had been cautious but hopeful now became fearful and protective, keeping their children indoors and viewing every stranger with suspicion. The investigation began to focus on identifying the owner of the dark sedan. Police compiled lists of every dark-colored vehicle registered in Millbrook and the surrounding towns, a tedious process that involved checking hundreds of cars and interviewing their owners. They also expanded their search to include anyone who might have been visiting the area that morning, anyone who might have had reason to be driving through Millbrook at that particular time. The net cast by investigators was wide but yielded few results. Most of the dark cars in the area belonged to longtime residents who had solid alibis for the morning of October 18th. The few vehicles that couldn't be immediately accounted for were traced to their owners, who were questioned and cleared. The investigation was thorough but frustrating, generating hundreds of interviews and thousands of pages of reports, but no solid leads. As the weeks passed, the case began to take on the characteristics of a cold case. The initial surge of media attention began to fade. The volunteer search efforts dwindled, and the investigation settled into a routine of following up on tips and pursuing dead-end leads. The Chen family continued to hope, continued to believe that their daughter would be found, but the reality was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. Sarah Chen had been taken by someone driving a dark sedan, someone who had been in the right place at the right time to intercept a small girl walking alone to Sunday school. But despite having this crucial piece of evidence, investigators were no closer to identifying the person responsible. The car had become a symbol of the case, a dark presence that had invaded their peaceful town and stolen one of their children, then disappeared without a trace. 3 weeks after Sarah's disappearance, as the investigation was beginning to lose momentum and the media attention was waning, a conversation over coffee at Millbrook's only diner would provide the first hint that the person responsible for Sarah's disappearance might not be the stranger everyone assumed. Eleanor Watkins had been a member of St. Matthew's for over 30 years. At 67, she was one of the congregation's most dedicated volunteers, serving on the altar guild, helping with church dinners, and maintaining the parish garden with the kind of devotion that only someone with deep faith and too much time on her hands could muster. She was also known for her sharp eyes and excellent memory, traits that had made her an invaluable witness in the past when the church had dealt with minor thefts and vandalism. On November 8th, Eleanor was having her usual Tuesday morning coffee with her friend Ruth Patterson when the conversation turned, as it inevitably did, to Sarah Chen's disappearance. The two women had discussed the case repeatedly over the past few weeks, sharing theories and expressing their fears about what had happened to the sweet little girl they had watched grow up in their congregation. "I just can't understand how someone could just drive into our town and take a child," Ruth was saying, stirring sugar into her coffee with more force than necessary. "It makes me sick to think about it." Eleanor nodded in agreement, then paused, a thoughtful expression crossing her weathered face. "You know," she said slowly, "I've been thinking about that car they showed on the news, the dark sedan from the security footage." Ruth looked up from her coffee. "What about it?" "Well, it reminded me of something," Eleanor continued, her voice growing more certain as she spoke. "I think I've seen that car before, or one just like it." Ruth leaned forward, suddenly interested. "Where?" "Behind the church," Eleanor said. "I remember because it struck me as odd at the time. It was parked in the small lot behind the parish hall, where we usually only see the same cars every Sunday. But this one was different, darker, and it was there several times over the past few months. The two women sat in silence for a moment, both understanding the potential significance of what Eleanor was saying. If the car in the security footage was the same one that had been parked behind the church, it meant that Sarah's abductor wasn't a random stranger passing through town. It was someone who had been watching, someone who had been planning, someone who was familiar with the church and its routines. Ruth urged Eleanor to contact the police immediately, and by noon that day, Detective Martinez was sitting in Eleanor's living room, listening intently as the elderly woman recounted what she had seen. Eleanor was a credible witness. Her memory was sharp, her observations were detailed, and she had no reason to fabricate or exaggerate her account. According to Eleanor, she had noticed the dark sedan parked behind the church on at least 3 occasions over the past 2 months. The first time had been in early September, when she had arrived early to prepare for a church dinner. The second time had been a few weeks later, when she had been working in the parish garden. The third time had been just a week before Sarah's disappearance, when Eleanor had been leaving the church after an altar guild meeting. What made these sightings significant was not just their frequency, but their timing. The car had been there during times when there were no scheduled church activities, when the parking lot would normally be empty. It was as if someone had been using the church as a place to watch and wait. Detective Martinez pressed Eleanor for more details about the car and its occupant. Had she seen anyone getting in or out of the vehicle? Had she noticed anything distinctive about the car itself? Did she have any idea who might have been driving it? Eleanor's answers were frustrating in their lack of specificity. She had seen the car but hadn't paid much attention to it at the time. She thought she might have seen a figure in the driver's seat on one occasion, but she couldn't provide any description. The car had been dark, black or dark blue, and appeared to be a sedan, but she couldn't identify the make or model. But Eleanor's statement accomplished something crucial. It established that Sarah's abductor was likely someone who was familiar with St. Matthew's, someone who had been watching the church and its routines. The investigation began to shift focus from looking for a random stranger to examining the church community itself. This was a troubling development for everyone involved. The idea that someone within their own congregation might be responsible for Sarah's disappearance was almost too horrible to contemplate. St. Matthew's was a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone, where trust was fundamental, where people looked out for each other's children. The possibility that this trust had been betrayed, that someone they knew and respected had taken Sarah, was devastating. Detective Martinez began the delicate process of investigating the church community more thoroughly. This meant taking a closer look at every member of the congregation, examining their backgrounds, their relationships with the Chen family, and their whereabouts on the morning of October 18th. It meant asking uncomfortable questions about people who had been friends and neighbors for years. The investigation focused particularly on male members of the congregation who had access to the church building outside of regular service times. This included the clergy, the church staff, and several volunteers who had keys to the building. Each of these individuals was interviewed again, this time with a sharper focus on their movements and activities in the weeks leading up to Sarah's disappearance. Father Brennan was among those interviewed, though his questioning was handled with particular sensitivity given his position in the community. The rector was cooperative and forthcoming, providing detailed information about his schedule and activities. He explained that he often worked late at the church, that he had keys to all areas of the building, and that he frequently met with parishioners for counseling and other pastoral duties. When asked about the dark sedan Eleanor had observed, Father Brennan was thoughtful, but couldn't provide any specific information. He noted that the parking lot behind the church was sometimes used by people attending meetings or events, and that it wasn't unusual for unfamiliar cars to be parked there. He expressed concern about the implications of Eleanor's statement and offered to help the investigation in any way he could. The interviews with other church members yielded similar results. Everyone was cooperative, everyone was concerned, and everyone wanted to help find Sarah. But no one could provide information that would identify the owner of the mysterious dark sedan or explain why it had been parked behind the church. As the investigation continued, the atmosphere at St. Matthew's began to change. The close-knit community that had come together in the aftermath of Sarah's disappearance now found itself under scrutiny. Members of the congregation began to view each other with suspicion, wondering if someone they trusted might be responsible for the unthinkable. The church that had been a source of comfort and strength for the Chen family was now a reminder of all the questions that remained unanswered. The investigation into Sarah Chen's disappearance continued for months, then years, but the initial burst of activity gradually gave way to a more routine process of following up on tips and pursuing dead-end leads. Detective Martinez was eventually reassigned to other cases, though she continued to receive updates on the Sarah Chen case and followed up on any new developments. The FBI closed their active investigation after 6 months, though they kept the case file open in case new evidence emerged. For the Chen family, the years following Sarah's disappearance were a blur of grief, hope, and gradual acceptance of a reality they had never wanted to face. Margaret Chen never returned to her teaching position, finding that she couldn't bear to be around children who were the same age Sarah would have been. David continued working at the bank, but colleagues noticed that he had become quiet and withdrawn, a shadow of the man he had been before his daughter's disappearance. The family continued to attend St. Matthew's, though their relationship with the church had become complicated. While they appreciated the support and prayers of the congregation, they also couldn't escape the knowledge that someone connected to the church might have been responsible for Sarah's disappearance. The building that had once been a source of joy and comfort now held too many painful memories and unanswered questions. Father Brennan remained supportive of the Chen family throughout this difficult period. He visited them regularly, provided counseling and comfort, and continued to organize prayer services for Sarah's safe return. The congregation looked to him for leadership and guidance during this dark time, and he rose to the challenge with grace and compassion. But as the years passed, the case began to fade from public attention. Other tragedies occurred, other cases demanded the attention of law enforcement, and the disappearance of Sarah Chen became one of those unsolved mysteries that haunted a community but no longer dominated its daily life. The missing person posters that had once covered every available surface in Millbrook were gradually removed or covered by new announcements. The case was not forgotten, but it was no longer the urgent crisis it had once been. The dark sedan from the security footage became a symbol of the case's frustration. Despite extensive investigation, despite hundreds of interviews and thousands of tips, investigators had never been able to identify the vehicle or its owner. The car had become a ghost, a phantom that had driven through their town one Sunday morning and vanished without a trace, taking Sarah Chen with it. There were occasional developments that briefly reignited interest in the case. A tip would come in, claiming to have seen Sarah in another state. A construction project would uncover bones that might belong to a child. A confession would be made by someone seeking attention or absolution. But each of these leads was carefully investigated and ultimately disproved, leaving the Chen family to endure the roller coaster of hope and disappointment over and over again. The investigation had examined every aspect of Sarah's life, every relationship, every possibility. Investigators had looked at family members, friends, neighbors, teachers, and church members. They had explored theories involving stranger abduction, family involvement, and local predators. They had consulted with experts in child psychology, criminal behavior, and missing persons cases. But despite all of this effort, they had been unable to solve the mystery of what had happened to Sarah Chen. As the 5th anniversary of Sarah's disappearance approached, the case had taken on the characteristics of a cold case. The active investigation had wound down, though the case file remained open, and any new tips or evidence would be thoroughly investigated. The Chen family had established a foundation in Sarah's name that worked to improve child safety and support other families dealing with missing children. They had found a way to honor their daughter's memory while continuing to live their lives, though the pain of her loss would never fully heal. The church community had also found ways to cope with the tragedy. Annual memorial services were held in Sarah's honor, and the congregation had established a scholarship fund for children attending Sunday school. Father Brennan had been instrumental in these efforts, helping the community process their grief and find meaning in their loss. But beneath the surface of these public displays of healing and hope, questions remained. The dark sedan was still out there somewhere, and so was the person who had been driving it. The investigation had established that someone familiar with the church had been watching and waiting, but that someone had never been identified. The case was unsolved, and for all the efforts of law enforcement and the community, it seemed likely to remain that way. As the years passed, some members of the congregation began to wonder if they would ever know the truth about what had happened to Sarah Chen. The case had become a permanent part of Millbrook's history, a reminder that evil could touch even the most peaceful communities, that trust could be betrayed, and that sometimes the most important questions never receive answers. But truth, as the community would eventually learn, has a way of emerging from even the deepest shadows. And sometimes it takes 20 years for the past to finally catch up with the present. The renovation of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church began in the spring of 2012, 20 years after Sarah Chen's disappearance. The beautiful stone building that had served as the heart of Millbrook's spiritual life for over a century was beginning to show its age, and the congregation had finally raised enough money to undertake the comprehensive restoration that the church desperately needed. The project was extensive, involving repairs to the roof, restoration of the stained glass windows, and updating of the electrical and plumbing systems. The work also included renovating the parish hall, the building adjacent to the main church where Sunday school classes were held, church dinners were served, and community meetings took place. It was in this building that Sarah Chen had attended Sunday school, where she had worked on her Noah's Ark project, where she had been expected to arrive on the morning she disappeared. The renovation was overseen by Thompson Construction, a local company that had been involved in historic preservation projects throughout central Massachusetts. The crew was led by foreman Jake Thompson, a skilled craftsman who understood the importance of preserving the building's historic character while making necessary modern improvements. On June 15, 2012, Thompson and his crew were working on renovating the Sunday school classrooms in the parish hall. The work involved removing old wainscoting and updating the electrical systems behind the walls. It was tedious work that required careful attention to preserve the building's historic details while making room for modern conveniences. Thompson was working on the wall in what had been Sarah Chen's Sunday school classroom when he noticed something unusual. As he carefully removed a section of old wood paneling, he discovered a small cavity behind the wall that didn't appear on any of the building's architectural plans. The space was about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, created by an irregularity in the building's original construction. At first, Thompson assumed the cavity was simply a quirk of the old building's construction. Historic buildings often contained odd spaces and architectural anomalies that reflected the building techniques of their era. But as he shone his flashlight into the space to ensure there were no electrical wires or other obstacles, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, in the dust and darkness of the hidden cavity, was a small canvas backpack. Even after 20 years, it was recognizable as a child's school bag, though it was faded and covered with dust. Thompson's hands shook as he carefully extracted the backpack from its hiding place, his mind racing with the implications of what he had found. The backpack was not empty. Inside, Thompson found several items that immediately confirmed his worst fears: coloring books, crayons, and what appeared to be a partially completed craft project involving construction paper animals. There was also a small slip of paper with a child's handwriting that read, "Sarah Chen, Grade 2, Sunday School." Thompson immediately stopped work and called the police. Within an hour, Chief Harrison had arrived at the scene, along with Detective Martinez, who had returned to the area and was now working with the county sheriff's office. The renovation work was halted, and the parish hall was sealed off as a crime scene. The discovery of Sarah's backpack sent shockwaves through the Millbrook community. After 20 years of wondering what had happened to the sweet 8-year-old who had disappeared on her way to Sunday school, they finally had concrete evidence that answered at least one crucial question. Sarah Chen had made it to the church that morning. Her backpack's presence in the hidden cavity proved that she had been in the building where she was supposed to be safe, where she was supposed to be learning about God's love and protection. But the discovery also raised even more disturbing questions. How had Sarah's backpack ended up hidden in a wall cavity in the very room where she attended Sunday school? Who had put it there, and why? If Sarah had made it to the church, what had happened to her once she arrived? And most troubling of all, who within the church community had been responsible for her disappearance? The investigation was immediately reopened with renewed urgency. The backpack was sent to the state crime lab for analysis, though investigators held little hope that useful DNA or fingerprint evidence would be found after 20 years. The hidden cavity was carefully examined for any other evidence, and the entire parish hall was searched thoroughly for additional clues. The discovery of the backpack also had a profound impact on the Chen family. Margaret and David Chen, now in their 60s, were notified of the find by Detective Martinez personally. After 20 years of wondering and hoping, they finally had proof that their daughter had made it to the church that morning. But this confirmation brought more pain than comfort. The realization that Sarah had been taken from the very place where she was supposed to be safest, where she had gone to learn about faith and love, was devastating. Margaret Chen's reaction was particularly heartbreaking. She had spent 20 years wondering if she had made the right decision in letting Sarah walk back home alone that morning. The discovery of the backpack confirmed that Sarah had indeed retrieved her belongings and made it to the church, but it also meant that something terrible had happened to her in the very building where Margaret had believed she would be protected. The church community was equally shaken by the discovery. The realization that Sarah had been in their midst that morning, that she had been taken from their own Sunday school classroom, transformed the tragedy from something that had happened to their community into something that had happened within their community. The violation felt personal and intimate in a way that made many congregation members question everything they had believed about their faith and their church. Father Brennan, now in his 60s and graying at the temples, was among those most affected by the discovery. He had led the congregation through the initial crisis 20 years earlier, had comforted the Chen family, had organized prayer services and search efforts. The revelation that Sarah had been taken from the very room where she had attended Sunday school, where he had visited her just days before her disappearance, was a blow that seemed to age him overnight. The investigation now focused on a much smaller pool of suspects. The fact that Sarah's backpack had been hidden in a wall cavity in the parish hall meant that whoever had taken her had intimate knowledge of the building's layout and construction. It also meant that the person responsible had access to the building, the time and opportunity to hide the backpack, and the composure to continue functioning normally within the church community for 20 years. The list of people who met these criteria was short and disturbing. It included the church staff, the clergy, and a small number of volunteers who had access to the building during off hours. Each of these individuals was interviewed again, this time with the knowledge that one of them was almost certainly responsible for Sarah's disappearance and probable death. Detective Martinez approached these interviews with a new sense of urgency and focus. The discovery of the backpack had transformed the case from a cold case into an active investigation, and she was determined to finally get answers for the Chen family and justice for Sarah. The interviews revealed interesting patterns and inconsistencies that hadn't been apparent 20 years earlier. Several church members mentioned that Father Brennan had been particularly devastated by Sarah's disappearance, that he had seemed to take it more personally than might have been expected even for a caring pastor. Others recalled that he had been unusually involved in the search efforts, often working late into the night to organize volunteers and coordinate with law enforcement. But it was the interview with Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, Sarah's former Sunday school teacher, that provided the most significant new information. Mrs. Morrison, now in her 70s and suffering from the early stages of dementia, had been living in a nursing home for several years. When Detective Martinez visited her, she found a woman whose memory was spotty, but who became remarkably lucid when the conversation turned to Sarah Chen. "That sweet little girl," Mrs. Morrison said, her eyes filling with tears. "She was so excited about her project that morning. She kept asking about Father Brennan, wondering if he was going to visit our classroom like he usually did." Detective Martinez pressed for more details about Father Brennan's visits to the Sunday school classroom. According to Mrs. Morrison, the rector had made a habit of stopping by the children's classes during Sunday school, spending time with the students and showing interest in their projects. But his visits had become more frequent in the weeks before Sarah's disappearance, and he had seemed particularly interested in Sarah's progress on her Noah's Ark project. "He would always make time for the children," Mrs. Morrison continued. "But with Sarah it was different. He would sit next to her, help her with her project, ask her about her week. She just lit up when he paid attention to her. She was so proud when he complimented her work." This information cast Father Brennan's relationship with Sarah in a new light. What had once seemed like normal pastoral care for a child in his congregation now appeared potentially more sinister. The fact that he had been paying special attention to Sarah in the weeks before her disappearance, combined with his access to the building and his knowledge of its layout, made him a person of significant interest in the investigation. But Detective Martinez was careful not to rush to conclusions. Father Brennan had been a respected member of the community for over 30 years, had provided comfort and leadership during the town's darkest hour, and had shown no signs of inappropriate behavior with children. The evidence was circumstantial, and she needed more than suspicious timing and access to the building to make an arrest. The investigation expanded to include a thorough examination of Father Brennan's background and history. Detectives contacted his previous parishes, interviewed former colleagues and parishioners, and searched for any history of inappropriate behavior or complaints. They also began the process of obtaining search warrants for his residence and personal belongings. It was during this background investigation that the first real breakthrough came. A former parishioner from Father Brennan's previous parish in Boston contacted the police after seeing news coverage of the reopened investigation. The woman, who wished to remain anonymous, reported that her daughter had complained about Father Brennan's behavior toward her in the 1980s, before he had come to Millbrook. According to the woman, her daughter had been uncomfortable with the way Father Brennan would single her out for attention, would find reasons to be alone with her, and would ask her inappropriate questions about her body and her relationships. The family had quietly left the parish rather than make a formal complaint, not wanting to create a scandal or be disbelieved. This information provided crucial context for the investigation. It suggested that Father Brennan had a history of inappropriate interest in children, and that his attention to Sarah Chen might have been part of a pattern of predatory behavior. Armed with this new information and the evidence provided by the discovery of Sarah's backpack, Detective Martinez obtained a search warrant for Father Brennan's residence. The search was conducted on July 3, 2012, just over 3 weeks after the backpack had been discovered. Father Brennan lived in a modest house adjacent to the church, a residence provided by the parish for the rector's use. The house was neat and well-maintained, filled with theological books, religious artifacts, and the accumulated possessions of a man who had lived a quiet, scholarly life. But hidden in the basement, behind a false wall that had been expertly constructed, investigators found evidence that would finally solve the mystery of Sarah Chen's disappearance. The hidden room contained a collection of children's clothing, photographs, and personal items that had clearly been taken from various children over the years. Among these items were several pieces of clothing that the Chen family would later identify as belonging to Sarah, including the small white ribbon that had been in her hair on the morning she disappeared. But perhaps most damning of all was a journal that Father Brennan had kept, documenting his crimes in careful detail. The journal contained entries dating back to his time in Boston, describing his inappropriate relationships with children and his methods for gaining their trust and accessing them. The entries about Sarah Chen were particularly disturbing, revealing that he had been planning her abduction for weeks, studying her routines and waiting for the right opportunity. According to the journal, Father Brennan had been in the parish hall that morning when Sarah arrived for Sunday school. He had convinced her to come with him to his office, claiming that he wanted to show her something special related to her Noah's Ark project. Once he had her alone, he had killed her, though the journal did not provide specific details about how she had died. The journal also revealed the location of Sarah's remains. Father Brennan had buried her in a remote section of the church cemetery, in an area that was rarely visited and where the ground would not be disturbed by regular maintenance. The body had been carefully concealed, and the grave had been disguised to look like a natural depression in the ground. The discovery of this evidence led to Father Brennan's immediate arrest on charges of kidnapping and murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through the Millbrook community, where the beloved rector had been trusted and respected for over 20 years. The man who had comforted the Chen family in their darkest hour, who had led prayer services for Sarah's safe return, who had been seen as a pillar of the community, was revealed to be the person responsible for the tragedy that had haunted the town for 2 decades. The interrogation of Father Brennan was conducted by Detective Martinez with assistance from FBI behavioral analysts. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against him, Father Brennan initially maintained his innocence, claiming that the items found in his home had been planted and that the journal was a forgery. But as the interrogation continued and the evidence mounted, his story began to crumble. What struck Detective Martinez most during the interrogation was not Father Brennan's denials, but the moments when his carefully constructed facade began to crack. When confronted with photographs of Sarah's ribbon, the same white ribbon he had complimented her on just days before her death, his hands began to shake uncontrollably. When shown pages from his own journal, describing in clinical detail how he had planned her abduction, his face contorted with what appeared to be genuine anguish. "Do you understand what you've done?" Martinez asked during one particularly intense moment. "You comforted her parents. You led prayer services for her safe return. You stood at her mother's side while she wept, knowing exactly where her daughter was." It was then that Father Brennan's composure finally shattered completely. For the first time in the interrogation, tears streamed down his face. Not tears of remorse for his victim, but tears of self-pity for the life he had built and was now losing. "I never meant for it to go that far," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I loved those children. I loved Sarah. But when she started to scream, when she wanted to run back to her mother—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The investigators watched in disgust as this man who had built his entire identity around moral authority and spiritual guidance revealed himself to be consumed by self-pity rather than genuine remorse. Even in his confession, he spoke of his love for the children he had victimized, unable to comprehend the true nature of his crimes. "For 20 years, Martinez pressed, you sat with her parents. You held Margaret Chen's hand while she cried. You prayed with them. How could you do that, knowing what you had done?" Brennan's response was perhaps the most chilling moment of the entire interrogation. "I thought if I could save other children, if I could be a good pastor to the rest of the congregation, maybe God would forgive me. Maybe I could make up for what I had done." He looked up at Martinez with eyes that seemed genuinely confused by his own actions. "I convinced myself that I was protecting the other children by staying quiet, that revealing the truth would hurt more people than it would help." The twisted logic of his rationalization, that his continued deception was somehow an act of pastoral care, revealed the depth of his delusion. He had managed to convince himself that his 20 years of lies and manipulation were actually a form of ministry, that his presence at Sarah's memorial services was somehow an act of compassion rather than the cruelest form of torture imaginable. Finally, after hours of questioning, Father Brennan confessed to killing Sarah Chen. But even his confession was tainted by self-serving justifications and attempts to minimize his actions. He admitted to luring Sarah to his office, to killing her when she began to scream, and to hiding her body in the cemetery. He also confessed to similar crimes involving other children, though Sarah was the only child he had killed. Throughout it all, he maintained that he had loved his victims, and that his crimes were somehow an expression of that love, a delusion that made his confession all the more disturbing. The confession provided the closure that the Chen family had been seeking for 20 years, but it also brought a new kind of pain. The realization that their daughter had been killed by someone they had trusted, someone who had sat in their living room and offered them comfort, someone who had pretended to share their grief while knowing exactly what had happened to their child, was almost unbearable. The discovery of Sarah's remains in the church cemetery was the final piece of the puzzle. The small body was carefully excavated and returned to the Chen family, who were finally able to give their daughter a proper burial. The funeral service was held at a different church, as the family could no longer bear to enter St. Matthew's. The arrest and confession of Father Michael Brennan marked the end of one of the most disturbing cases in Massachusetts history. But it was also the beginning of a long and painful process of reckoning for the Millbrook community. The revelation that their beloved rector had been a predator who had killed a child in their own church building challenged everything they had believed about their faith, their community, and their ability to protect their children. The Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts immediately launched an investigation into how Father Brennan had been able to operate undetected for so long. The investigation revealed a pattern of missed warning signs, inadequate background checks, and a culture of silence that had allowed Brennan to move from parish to parish without his crimes being detected. The diocese faced numerous lawsuits from victims and their families, including a substantial settlement with the Chen family. But for Margaret and David Chen, no amount of money could compensate for the loss of their daughter or the 20 years of anguish they had endured. The settlement did, however, allow them to expand their foundation and continue their work to prevent similar tragedies from happening to other families. The Millbrook community struggled to come to terms with the betrayal. Many members of St. Matthew's congregation left the church, unable to reconcile their faith with the revelation that their spiritual leader had been a killer. Others stayed and worked to rebuild, viewing the tragedy as a test of their faith and their commitment to their community. A new rector was brought in to lead the congregation, but the healing process was slow and difficult. The parish hall where Sarah had been killed was renovated and rededicated, but many parishioners could never again enter the building without remembering what had happened there. The church cemetery, where Sarah's body had been hidden for 20 years, became a place of pilgrimage for some and a source of pain for others. The case also had broader implications for how religious institutions handle allegations of abuse and misconduct. The revelation that Father Brennan had been able to operate for so long without detection led to calls for better screening procedures, more oversight of clergy, and greater transparency in handling abuse allegations. For the Chen family, the resolution of the case brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. They were grateful to finally know what had happened to their daughter, but the details of her death and the 20 years of deception were almost too painful to bear. Margaret Chen, now in her 70s, spoke publicly about the case for the first time, expressing her hope that Sarah's story would help prevent other children from suffering the same fate. The trial of Father Brennan was swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence and his own confession, he pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no remorse during the sentencing hearing, maintaining the same cold demeanor that had characterized his confession. The case officially closed with Brennan's conviction, but its impact on the Millbrook community would last for generations. The small town that had once prided itself on its safety and its faith had learned that evil could hide behind the most trusted facades, that the very institutions meant to protect children could become the source of their destruction. In the years following Father Brennan's conviction, the story of Sarah Chen became a cautionary tale that resonated far beyond the borders of Millbrook, Massachusetts. The case highlighted the vulnerability of children in trusted institutions and the devastating consequences of misplaced faith in authority figures. Margaret Chen, despite her advanced age and the trauma she had endured, became an advocate for child safety and institutional accountability. She worked tirelessly to ensure that Sarah's story would serve as a warning to other parents and communities, speaking at conferences and working with lawmakers to strengthen background check requirements for those who work with children. The Sarah Chen Foundation, established in the years following her disappearance, expanded its mission to include education about institutional abuse and support for other families dealing with similar tragedies. The Foundation's work helped to prevent other children from suffering Sarah's fate, turning her tragic death into a force for positive change. The town of Millbrook slowly began to heal, though the scars of the tragedy would never fully disappear. The community that had once been defined by its innocence and faith was now defined by its vigilance and its commitment to protecting its children. Parents were more cautious, institutions were more accountable, and the easy trust that had once characterized the town was replaced by a harder-won wisdom about the nature of evil and the importance of vigilance. St. Matthew's Episcopal Church survived the scandal, though it was forever changed by the revelation of what had happened within its walls. The congregation that remained was smaller but stronger, bound together by their shared experience of betrayal and their determination to prevent future tragedies. The church became a model for other religious institutions, demonstrating how a community could confront its darkest moments and emerge with a renewed commitment to its values. The case of Sarah Chen serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most trusted facades, that the very people entrusted with protecting children can sometimes be the ones who harm them. But it also demonstrates the power of truth to eventually emerge, even after decades of silence, and the importance of never giving up the search for justice. As Margaret Chen said in her final public statement about the case, Sarah's death was a tragedy that could have been prevented if people had been more vigilant, more willing to ask difficult questions, and more committed to protecting children than to protecting institutions. I hope that her story will help ensure that no other child suffers the fate that she did, and that no other family has to endure the 20 years of anguish that we experienced. The small backpack that had been hidden in the wall for 20 years became a symbol of the case, a reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of eventually coming to light. And in that truth, painful as it was, the Chen family and the Millbrook community finally found the closure they had been seeking for so long. Today, if you visit Millbrook on a Sunday morning, you'll find a town that has learned to live with its scars. The streets are still quiet, the houses still well maintained, the sense of community still strong. But there's something different in the air, a wariness, a vigilance that wasn't there before Sarah Chen's disappearance changed everything. St. Matthew's Episcopal Church still stands on the town green, its stone walls weathered but enduring. The congregation is smaller now, but those who remain have found a way to honor Sarah's memory while rebuilding their faith. The parish hall where she was killed has been renovated and rededicated, transformed into a bright space filled with children's laughter and learning. But perhaps the most haunting reminder of Sarah's story comes every Sunday morning at exactly 9:03 a.m., when the church bells begin to toll. The sound echoes across the town green, through the quiet streets, past the house on Maple Street where the Chen family once lived. It's the same time that Sarah Chen passed in front of the security camera for the last time, her small figure captured on grainy black and white film, as she hurried toward what she thought was safety. The bells ring out across Millbrook, a weekly reminder of the 8-year-old girl who walked out of her house one Sunday morning with her backpack and her hopes for finishing her Noah's Ark project. They ring for the parents who lost their only child, for the community that lost its innocence, and for all the children who came after Sarah, the ones who are now protected by the vigilance and the hard-won wisdom that emerged from her tragedy. Margaret Chen, now in her 80s and still living in Millbrook, can hear those bells from her bedroom window. She no longer attends St. Matthew's, but she listens to them ring every Sunday morning, remembering her daughter's excitement about Sunday school, her careful preparations for church, her eagerness to please her teachers and her pastor. The bells that once called Sarah to worship now serve as her eternal memorial, a weekly reminder that even in death, her story continues to protect other children. As the bells fade into silence each Sunday morning, the town of Millbrook continues with its day, forever changed by the knowledge that evil can hide behind the most trusted facades, but strengthened by the conviction that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually find its way to the light. And in that truth, painful as it was to discover, Sarah Chen's legacy lives on, not as a victim, but as a guardian, watching over the children who walk the same quiet streets where she once played and laughed and dreamed of growing up. The last bell echoes and fades, leaving only the morning quiet and the memory of a little girl who, in death, became the protector she never had the chance to be in life.